Hey everyone, Mr. Tweet here. So let's go over this model of comparative advantage. Um, Basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be setting up the model the same way, whether it's an input or output question, but we're going to do a couple things differently if it's input. All right, so we're going to set it up the same way. We're always going to put, you know, the people or the countries, we're always going to want to put them on the side and the stuff on the top. Now, occasionally, College Board will give you a question where they'll already have the matrix or the table set up for you. And like 80% of the time, they have it set up the right way, where they got the people on the side and they got the stuff on the top. But like 20% of the time, or maybe 10% of the time, they do it the opposite way just to kind of mess with you. So if they do that, if they give it to you like that, then we're going to just rewrite the table. All right. So we're going to have the things that are being produced on the top. So I've got, maybe tacos and pizza being produced by the United States and by Mexico. So I'm going to set it up like this, whether it's an input or output question. I'm going to start off by writing the people, places on the side, and on the top, we're going to have the things. And then we're going to take whatever information that's given to us, like in a paragraph or a short answer question. We're going to take that information and we're going to put that into our table, right? Whether it's input or output. So let's say it says, the United States can produce, 100 tacos, or it can produce 10 pizzas. And let's say Mexico can do 50 tacos or 40 pizzas. All right. So there we go. We put our numbers in there. Now, if those numbers represent the amount of pizza and tacos being produced, it's an output question. If those numbers represent the amount of resources to produce some amount of tacos or pizza, if the numbers represent resources, then it's an input question. So if this was like, the number of ounces of water needed, or the number of workers needed, or the number of kilowatt hours of electricity needed, or if it represents amounts of a resource or time, then it's going to be an input question. Right? So once we have it set up, we're going to go through and we're going to find first the absolute advantage. Now, if it's an output question, the bigger number is better for output. If it's an input question, the smaller number is better because it means you can do it with less resources. So assuming this is an output question, we're going to go through and we would just go down the tacos column and we would pick the bigger number to find the absolute advantage. The United States has got the absolute advantage in tacos, and Mexico has the absolute advantage in pizza. Now, to find the comparative advantage, we're going to use opportunity costs. Now, in a situation like this, where one country has one absolute and the other country has the absolute, it's easy. It's going to be the same for comparative advantages. So let me change my numbers here and make it a little bit more realistic for a tougher AP level question. Let's say the United States, instead of doing 10 pizzas, let's say the United States can do 75 pizzas. Now, the United States has the absolute advantage in both, right? Again, Adam Smith, very smart economist. He was like, nope, they shouldn't trade. The United States is just better. They shouldn't trade with Mexico. David Ricardo came along, and David Ricardo was like, no, right? It's not the absolute advantage that matters. It's the comparative advantage that matters. What matters is what you have to give up. Because what we're going to see here, right, for output questions, the other number goes over. So to find the Mexico opportunity cost for making one taco, I'm going to take what they give up divided by what they get, and I get 4/5, 40 over 50, or 4/5. Now, for Mexico to find their opportunity cost for a pizza, it's what they give up for what they get. It's going to be 50 over 40, which is 5/4. Notice that for each person or country, their opportunity costs are always reciprocals. They're always reciprocals. For the United States, to find the comparative advantage, it's going to be 75 over 100, or 3/4, and 100 over 75, which is going to be 4/3. Again, reciprocals. then the next task that you need to do is you need to figure out which one is smaller, because if you have a smaller opportunity cost, that means you give up less to make it, which is good. You have the comparative advantage. So for tacos, we'll have to go through and figure out what's smaller, 3/4 or 4/5, 0.75 or 0.8. 0.75 is smaller. So the United States has got the comparative advantage on tacos. Now, we should check to make sure that Mexico has it for pizza, because one country always has one and the other country always has the other. So if you get the same comparative advantages, you've done something wrong, right? So 4/3, 1.33. 5/4, that's 1.2. 1.2 is smaller than 1.33. So we're going to go with Mexico has got the comparative advantage on pizza. So we set it up the same, whether it is, an input or an output question. However, if this was an input question, all of these fractions would be flipped. All right, because the smaller number is better, and so then we flip the fractions, and then once we flip the fractions, then on these the smaller number is better. When we flip the fractions, then that accounts for that, and then the smaller opportunity cost prevails again. So we're always picking the smaller fraction. It's just for input questions the fractions are flipped, and that's the difference. Now, how do we identify input versus output questions? Well, you got to look at the question itself. So I'm going to share my screen with you now. Last thing we'll do is we'll practice this a little bit. And I have a couple of worksheets here that come from college economics classes. So the first one that we're looking at right here, this first one is from the University of Michigan. So in one of their econ classes, this is one of their professors uses this with their students, right? So the question number 5 here, suppose that Austria and Belgium have the unit labor requirements for producing steel and brooms shown in the table at the right. So what do these numbers represent here, right? Well, these numbers don't represent amount of steel and brooms. Those numbers represent amounts of labor, and labor is our most important resource. So that makes number 5 right here on this worksheet, that makes this an input question. So to figure out who's got the comparative advantage and who's got the absolute advantage, we're going to, first of all, for absolute advantage, smaller numbers are going to be better, right? Notice that this professor here, by the way, put the countries on the top and the stuff on the side, so we'd want to rewrite that table. Smaller numbers are better because it means that you need less labor to do the same thing. So for this one right here, if we're looking at brooms, Belgium is better than Austria because Belgium has the absolute advantage because it takes them less labor. If we're looking at steel, Austria 3, Belgium 8. For steel, Austria has the absolute advantage because it takes them fewer workers to do the same thing as Belgium. So Austria's got it for steel, Belgium has it for brooms, and then always if they have opposite, if one has one absolute and the other has the other absolute, it's going to be the same thing with comparative advantage. But we could go through and we could do the math and you can find the opportunity cost and it should work out the same. Feel free to pause the video and do that if you want. Let's look at number 6 now. For number 6, we've got suppose Austria and Brazil have the outputs per worker in producing sleds and clarinets shown in the table at the right. So these numbers represent the amount of output per worker. This is the number of sleds and clarinets being produced. So this is an output question. Notice that there's still a resource in this question. There's still workers, but the number of workers is the same. It's per worker. It's one worker for everything. But what the workers produce is different in one country than another country because of technology and other stuff. So this is an output question. Bigger numbers, better for absolute advantage. When it comes to comparative advantage, remember the OO in IOU. Output other over, OOO, and then the IOU is input, the other number goes under. So what we're going to do for this one is we would take the other number, put it over, but again, our table is all messed up because that's how this professor did it, but whatever. All right, so Input questions, it's the amount of resource like labor or time that's changing. On an output question, it's going to be the amount of stuff being produced. Let's look at one more. This comes from the University of Santa Barbara. University of California at Santa Barbara, UCSB. Again, another major economic school like Michigan. The small island nation of Ruritania is populated by 2 farmers, Alf and Barney. Each farmer has 100 acres. The land can be used for either growing wheat or pasture for cattle. Alf's land is better than Barney's land. Each acre that Alf plants to wheat will produce 50 bushels of wheat per year. Each acre that Alf devotes to pasture will produce 70 pounds of beef. Each acre that Barney plants will be 25 bushels of wheat, and each acre that Barney devotes to his pasture will be 30 pounds of beef. There's a lot of information here, but what we want to break it down into is these numbers, 50 and 70 and 25 and 30, what are they referring to? Because that's what's changing. Notice that the 100 acres is the same for both. So the input, the resource, the amount of land isn't changing. But what they're producing, bushels of wheat, pounds of beef, that is changing. So that makes this an output question because the thing being produced is different between the two of them. So this is an output question. We can set it up. The other number goes over for us to find the lower opportunity cost. Let's look at another one. There are 100 workers in the country of North Potato and 100 workers in the country of South Potato. Workers in either country work 50 hours per week, and they can spend their time either producing food or clothing. It takes North Potato a worker 20 hours to produce a unit of food and 5 hours to produce a unit of clothing. South Potato, it's 40 hours to produce food, 5 hours to produce clothing. Blah, 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 right? If we wanted to set this up, right, notice that what we have going on here, it's the amount of hours that's changing. 50 hours versus 20 hours, 5 hours versus 40 hours. It's the input that is variable on this question. So this would be an input. So we'd set it up the same way, South Potato, North Potato on the side. We would have, clothing and food up on the top of our table. We'd put our numbers in there, 50, 25, 40. And then, because it's an input question, for absolute advantage, the smaller number is better when comparing them. So we'd compare food to food, clothing to clothing. Smaller number gives you the absolute advantage because you can produce it with fewer hours of work, right? Then to find the comparative advantage, which is what we really care about because it tells you what to specialize in, to find the comparative advantage, we would use the IOU. For input questions, we take the other number and we put it under, right? So we would go through that way, and then we would find the smaller opportunity cost, and that would give us our answer. So that's mostly it. I'm going to go through and I'm going to do this problem for you right now. Now, if you get it and you're like, I don't need to go through you doing this for me, Mr. Tweet, cool. Don't worry about it. You can click stop and go back to the slides, do whatever you want to do, get on with your life. If you want to know why the answer is the right answer for that one, then let me go over that for you. Now, I skipped the bottom half of this question where it gets even more complicated because it doesn't really matter. So I'm only looking at this right here that I've highlighted. Okay, so I want to know, based on these numbers, I'm not worried about the second half of this question. All I want to know is who should produce clothing, who should produce food. All right, so I'm going to set up my problem. I've got North Potato, South Potato, I've got food, and I've got clothing. So you can see here, North Potato, South Potato, food, clothing. And for North Potato, it takes a worker 20 hours to produce a unit of food. So remember, these are number of hours to produce. Or they can do 5 hours to do a unit of clothing. And South Potato is 40 and 5. All right. So here we go. I've got my thing set up. Food and clothing on the top, north potato, south potato on the side. So now, right, I got to remember this is an input question. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just write this. I'll write the IOU or OOO up in the corner so I remember input question versus output question. So this is an input question. So first, who's got the absolute advantage, right? Well, the absolute advantage is whoever can produce the thing with less resources. So when it comes to food, North Potato has the absolute advantage because it only takes them 20 hours to make food. It takes South Potato 40 hours to produce food. On clothing, there is no absolute advantage because they're tied. So nobody has the advantage over the other. There is no advantage. Not both, neither has the absolute advantage because they're tied. Now we want to know who's got the comparative advantage, right? So we're going to set up our fractions. Because this is an input question, right? What I'm going to put right here, I'm going to take the other number and put it under. So I'm going to go 20 over 5. Right here, I'm going to take, right here, I'm going to take the other number and put it under. So I get 5 over 20. Right here, 40, for this one right here, 40 over 5. And right here, I get 5 over 40. Okay? So I take the other number and I put it under. And then, once I've done that, the smaller fraction gives you your comparative advantage. Now, we can do that. Notice that it's still reciprocals going across. Still reciprocals going across, right? So the smaller number gives us our comparative advantage, and we go down each column. So let's see who's got the comparative advantage at producing food. I've got 20 over 5, which is equal to 4. And I've got 40 over 5, which equals 8. 4 is smaller than 8. So, I don't remember what the name of the countries are. Or no, these are the items that they're making. So for food, North Potato, how did I forget that? North Potato has the comparative advantage at producing food because they can do it cheaper. And then over here, 5/40ths is smaller than 5/20ths. So because 5/40ths is smaller, that means that South Potato has the comparative advantage when it comes to making clothing. So South Potato should make the clothing, North Potato should make the food, and then they should trade. All right. And that's the comparative advantage model, right? So we set it up the same, stuff on the top, people on the sides. We plug in the numbers of what's changing. We check to see, is it an input or an output question? We find the absolute advantage. Output question, bigger numbers. Input question, smaller numbers. We then find the opportunity cost per unit to figure out who's got the comparative advantage. For output questions, OOO, other number over. For input questions, in IOU, for input, the other number goes under. You pick on both input and output. Once you got there, it's the same from that point forward. Smaller opportunity cost gives you the comparative advantage. All right. And then I could ask more questions and say, like, who should import what? Who should export what? You import what you don't have an advantage in. You export what you do have an advantage in. You specialize what you have an advantage in. You don't specialize in what you don't have an advantage in. There you go. All right. So there's some practice questions. Make sure you practice this. Tomorrow, we're going to add, I'm going to add one more concept on top of this, and we'll do a little practice. But this right here, the comparative advantage model, this is your test for Unit 3. It's going to require you to do this, okay? This pops up on the AP test every year. So you should expect a couple multiple choice questions on the AP test like this, 3 or 4 of them maybe, maybe 2, or an FRQ even on the AP test like this. So you should be prepared for this for next week for our test. All right, guys, have a good one. and I'll see you around. Peace.